Hello everyone, more fallacies to discuss today. Yes, fallacies again are mistaken arguments, and we study the mistakes so as not to commit them and to recognize them not only when we commit them but in writing and in speeches made by others and ordinary discourse. We're going to start with the fallacy of unqualified authority, ad verecundiam, and verecundiam. The unqualified authority is pretty much what it sounds like. It's when someone has spoken on a topic as if they were authoritative, and we might even trust their opinion, but they're not an authority in this area. Perhaps they're an authority in some other area. I often noted that the celebrity endorsements are the persons giving the celebrity endorsements, actors or actresses or ball players, are expert in some area. Just that they're not expert in the area usually that they're giving the endorsement in. So Michael Jordan, arguably the greatest basketball player that ever lived, is not an expert on sneakers. He often endorses sneakers. He also endorsed Gatorade, and he probably is not an expert on electrolytes. So, but he's able to sell sneakers and Gatorade aplenty because of his name. So that would be an example, of ad verecundiam. But any endorsement like that uses a celebrity to endorse some product about which they're not in the know. His expertise is in playing the game, not in describing products. Also, when people speak from a position of authority as if they're in authority, but they have some bias, I've come to distrust all of the president's statements about the coronavirus, that it can be cured by UV light, it can be cured by hydroxychloroquine, warm weather would take care of it, even miracles. Now, of course, some of you recognize some false cause fallacies in there, but he's no authority on this subject, not a scientist. One wonders what his area of expertise is. It seems not to be in the sciences, however, and so that would be the ad verecundiam fallacy. Whenever someone has a bias or vested interest in saying what they say, they can be suspect in what their deliverance is here. I also want to get to the second fallacy I want to get to. I have plenty of examples in a fallacy document that I've posted. But the second fallacy is the fallacy of begging the question. It's also called circular reasoning. Begging the question is when you assume the very point at issue instead of proving the point at issue. If I write you a check and the check bounces, and you say, "Why did you bounce me a check?" And I say, "Well, I guess there wasn't enough money in the bank." Well, of course there wasn't enough money in the bank. You're not asking that. Presumably you know that. You're asking why wasn't enough money in the bank and why did I write a check that would bounce? So I beg your original question. Why did you write me a bouncing check? So too, someone who doesn't use an actual question can be committing the fallacy of begging the question. If someone says, all murder is wrong, so abortion is wrong, they've assumed that abortion is murder before they can get to that conclusion that abortion is wrong. They've slipped the premise under the rug, but they'd have to prove first that abortion is murder. They didn't do that by accident, probably. They didn't want to. They didn't want to demonstrate. It's not an easy thing to demonstrate that abortion is murder. You first have to discuss what a person is, and are you murdering a person, and is it murder at all, as opposed to just killing. But so too, someone might say, all murder is wrong, and capital punishment is wrong. Well, you'd have to say first that capital punishment is murder to get to that conclusion that capital punishment is wrong. Capital punishment is killing, but is all killing equivalent to murder? Likely not. So these kinds of examples beg the question. Since we're talking about a fallacy with question in the name, let's look at the fallacy of complex question. The fallacy of complex question will always be easy to pick out. It'll end with a question mark. The age-old example that might pop up in a courtroom, when did you stop beating your wife? The prosecution says to the defendant. Well, if you ask the question in that way, it's called a loaded question, a leading question in legal circles, and you don't give the defendant a chance to exculpate themselves. Rather, you'd have to break the question down into, did you beat her? And if yes to that question, then when did you stop? When did you stop beating your wife? If the person says, well, last Tuesday, he's just incriminated himself. And so a complex question is a loaded question, and how long have you been cheating at cards? why is a Lexus the best car on the road today? It hasn't proven that it is the best car on the road. The advertisement, which is very clever, just assumes that and is asking why it is. How long have you been using cocaine? Assumes that you are. It doesn't give you a chance to answer the question without incriminating yourself. So complex question does that. We also have, I want to look at the other fallacies that we need to go over here. Appeal to ignorance. Now, appeal to ignorance, the Latin is ad ignorantiam, you'll notice. Appeal to ignorance is drawing a conclusion on little or basis of little or no evidence. So sometimes people just speculate or speak off the cuff, but they really don't have evidence. This is when they're appealing to no evidence whatsoever. Some of the examples I just gave about hydroxychloroquine and sunlight and warm weather and miracles, there's no basis, no evidential base for drawing those conclusions. So one might also see them as appeals to ignorance when people just speculate. Someone might make a prediction about the future based on no evidence. In the next 2 years we may see a basketball player better than LeBron James. Well, we might, but if you assert that strongly, you'd have to say on what basis that is the evidence there. To assume something on the basis of little or no evidence is to commit the fallacy of ad ignorantiam. This often comes up when people say things like there's when they believe in superstitions, or the Ouija board was popular a few years back, that somehow they believe it works by the spirits have been invoked and they move the shot glass across the board, things of this sort, based on no tangible evidence. And so the ad ignorantiam fallacy rears its head there. There's also the fallacy of slippery slope. You've probably heard this one. You may not have realized the name or that it was slippery slope being committed, but you've probably seen it in action. One of the reasons slippery slope is when you assume that some action will set off a chain reaction and a slippery slope will follow. In casual use, people used to say if you listen to rock and roll, then sex and drugs will follow, that this will get you all excited and you'll slide down some slippery slope. The slippery slope image is right down to hell. You'll descend into darkness or evil. So that's the basis of slippery slope. It's a favorite of preachers, especially fire and brimstone preachers who warn against these small sins that can lead to bigger sins, or people who say don't use marijuana. It's a gateway drug and you'll go to a slippery slope right to harder drugs and won't be able to stop. And so there's part of the slippery slope too. The next fallacy I wanted to get to is the fallacy of weak analogy. Just what it sounds like. It's when you make a comparison between two things, but the comparison, rather than being a strong one, showing many things in common between the two things you're comparing, let's say X and Y, they have more things not in common. I used to think that when people in the early years of the Iraq War were calling it a quagmire, remember the United States invaded Iraq in March of 2003. In the early stages, people were comparing it to Vietnam, one of the wars I grew up with, in which America was entrenched for some 11 years. I thought that was a weak analogy. But as we stayed and stayed and stayed, and were there a total of 8.5 years, it was not such a weak analogy after all. It was, as people say, a quagmire. We got bogged down in it and couldn't leave. It didn't have the duration of the Vietnam War, but actually pretty close. So there's an analogy there. Sometimes an analogy is strong if you can show that the basis for the two things being compared is in fact strong. But if it is a weak one, then you have no business making that connection. In addition, we can look at the fallacy of false dichotomy. Dichotomy is a split. This is sometimes called bifurcation. It's called the either-or fallacy, the black and white fallacy. It probably has the most names of any fallacy, but it's saying that either you do X or you do Y, as if there was no third or fourth alternative. It doesn't always have to be two alternatives. Sometimes you offer somebody 3 alternatives when actually there's many more. being a child of the 1960s, people, when there were protesters, hippies protesting and people protesting in racism and Vietnam War, those who didn't like the protests would say, America, love it or leave it, as if there were only two choices, stay or go. Well, now people are looking at third alternatives, that you stay and try to change it for the better. That's the basis for the current protests, I believe. And it is being changed, I hope, for the better. So the love it or leave it fallacy was a false dichotomy. Someone might say in a fit of anger or pique, either you marry me or I'll kill myself. Well, I hope those aren't the only two alternatives. There's other ways to look at this, but that's dramatic, and it's probably using a bit of pity there, appeal to force, that if I am to end my life, it'll be on your head that I did so. But so, false dichotomy, either or, this can come up. I see it being done all the time. People just can't seem to hold two thoughts in their head, and so you're either one thing or the other. People will say things like, it's either Tom Brady or Joe Montana. That's a harmless example. One of those two is the greatest quarterback of all time. Well, not necessarily. There could be third, fourth, and fifth alternatives. Notice that that's happened in basketball. I know that by some of your responses, some of you like basketball. I do too. I've written several basketball books, in fact. But I don't think the two alternatives should be reduced to just LeBron James and Michael Jordan. I do not. I think that it's LeBron James or Michael Jordan or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Wilt Chamberlain or Bill Russell. There are several candidates for the throne, right? We can't just reduce it to several. And so you beware the fallacy of false dichotomy, the either-or fallacy. It crops up all the time in our ordinary thinking. And what it does is limit our thinking in many cases. And the last one I wanted to go over today was the fallacy of suppressed evidence. It is as it sounds. It's when you give an explanation to someone, but you leave things out of that explanation, as we used to say, accidentally on purpose. It's often the case that when you tell your story, or anyone tells a story, it doesn't have to be a sad, pitiable story, to a third party, that you leave out evidence that will benefit you. That's one of the hallmarks of a fib, is that you do leave it out. So suppressing evidence changes the way the conclusion will draw, because you're leaving out evidence that, if it was brought to light, would change the conclusion. I will be furnishing you with more examples of these fallacies in days to come, but I wanted to get you started. Thank you. Bye.